Hi, this is Josh Marshall from TPM, and this is the setup for Monday, June 11th, 2012. And today we're talking about last week's Wisconsin recall election and the fate of public sector unions. As you know, last week was the conclusion of more than a year of political controversy and mobilization in the state of Wisconsin, going back to a big move that Governor Scott Walker made in early 2011 to dramatically cut pay and eliminate collective bargaining rights for most public sector unions in the state. It looked at first that Democrats were going to have a good shot at recalling a lot of Republican office holders, including the governor, but it all came to a head last Tuesday, and Governor Scott Walker won the recall election pretty handily. Now, the labor movement, and particularly public sector unions, their lives really on the line in that election, and they went all in and they lost. And that's raised a lot of questions about the popularity of the union movement in this country, again, particularly public sector unions, and what their fate is over the coming years. There were also two less watched elections out in California that were over public employee pensions, and the unions lost pretty handily there too. So this is not just something that happened in Wisconsin, it's something broader nationally, and it points to a real vulnerability that these public sector unions have across the country. So is this going to be one of the signature issues of the 2012 campaign? You see over the last week, both Mitt Romney and Barack Obama have gotten into a fight over particularly this issue, with Mitt Romney saying we don't need more teachers, first responders, and so forth. So what to make of this? Let's step back for a moment and look at public sector unions in the country as a whole and also as a part of the labor movement. You know, going back 30 or 40 years, public sector unions are a larger and larger part of a shrinking labor movement in the United States. There are a lot of causes for that, some of them economic, some of them political, but the real driver is the fact that public sector unions, they're isolated from the forces of globalization which have ravaged the labor movement in the private sector. Your local teachers, the police department in your town, they can't be outsourced and sent overseas. So again, that has protected public sector unions in a way that unions in the private sector have not been protected. Now, that's been good for public sector unions in a sense, but you can also see that it's left them isolated politically, and that's part of what you see in those election results last Tuesday, especially in the context of a very down economy and one in which those people's salaries are being paid by taxpayers. John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, was also elected in 2010, and he pursued a very similar push against public sector unions. But state Democrats pursued a very different strategy. They didn't go for a recall of Kasich the way that the Wisconsin Democrats did. They went very narrowly at the issue of collective bargaining rights. And polls show that when it comes to what most voters see as a basic issue of equity, of fairness, the right to collectively bargain, that the public really does support this. Democrats put that specific issue on the ballot in Ohio. Not Governor Kasich, not broader questions about public sector unions, but very specifically the issue of collective bargaining. And the unions and Democrats won big time. They turned back Kasich's law by a 2-to-1 margin in Ohio. So what's the big picture? I think there's no getting around the fact that there is a level of public resentment against public sector unions. That shouldn't surprise us terribly in bleak economic times. But what we also see in these different elections is that the Democrats in Wisconsin probably lost to a certain extent because people don't like recalls. It offends certain people's just sense of political propriety when someone hasn't actually been guilty of political malfeasance. And they weren't able to narrow in on that very specific issue of collective bargaining rights for public sector unions. In other words, it's a much more nuanced, complex picture when you look up close. And I think both campaigns are going to be looking at those details as they try to fight this out politically over the next 4.5 months. I'm Josh Marshall from TPM, and we'll talk to you next week.